What if your own children, your flesh and blood, could be capable of murder? How well can we ever truly know the ones we love? And what happens when the very people you trust the most are the ones who betray you in the most unimaginable way? In August of 1989, in the affluent suburbs of Beverly Hills, a tragedy struck that would unravel the very fabric of an all-American family. Two young men, Lyle and Erik Menendez, had just committed a crime so horrific it would shake the nation. But as the investigation unfolded, questions began to surface. Was this just a brutal act of rage, or was there something deeper, something more shocking, driving the men to kill their own parents? Tonight, we delve into one of the most chilling family tragedies in modern American history. The case of the Menendez brothers, whose lives seemed perfect from the outside, but were tainted by dark secrets no one could have predicted. This is the story of what really happened behind the closed doors of their luxury estate, the secrets they kept, and the brutal legacy that continues to haunt them today. Stay with us. What you're about to hear will make you question everything about the people you trust most. It was a house that seemed to have it all. Set in the heart of Beverly Hills, where the palm trees lined the streets like sentinels and the sun always seemed to shine a little brighter, the Menendez family's home was a symbol of success, wealth, and the American dream. A mansion that stood as a testament to everything that Jose and Mary Louise Menendez had worked for. Jose Menendez, a Cuban immigrant, had come to America with nothing but dreams and determination. By the 1980s, he was a well-established businessman, the head of a talent agency that represented Hollywood's elite. His empire was built on hard work and unrelenting ambition, propelling him to great heights of wealth. A man of confidence and control, Jose had cultivated an image of a self-made success, a man whose word was law. His professional life was flourishing, but his personal life, his family, told a different story. Mary Louise, or Kitty, was the perfect complement to her husband's success. She was polished, poised, and the epitome of Beverly Hills elegance. As a wife and mother, she fit the role of the doting housewife, always at her husband's side, attending charity galas, hosting dinner parties, and nurturing the family. Kitty was a woman who appeared to have everything: beauty, charm, and a life that many would envy. Together, Jose and Kitty created an image of the perfect family, raising two sons, Lyle and Erik, inside their grand estate. Lyle, the older son, was everything Jose had dreamed of in a child. Charismatic, driven, and a natural leader, Lyle had inherited his father's ambition. He was the kind of person who, even at a young age, seemed destined for success. Lyle worked hard to live up to his father's expectations and often found himself in competition with others for his father's approval. His relationship with Jose, though outwardly loving, was based on achievement, and Lyle knew his worth in his father's eyes was tied to his performance. Erik, on the other hand, was more introverted. The younger son, born 3 years after Lyle, often felt overshadowed by his older brother's presence and by his father's demanding expectations. Sensitive and thoughtful, Erik found it difficult to live up to the image of perfection his family demanded. Despite his intelligence, he was a quieter figure, often retreating inwardly as he struggled to find his place within the family dynamic. To the outside world, the Menendez family appeared to live a dream life. They were wealthy, successful, and well-connected. The sons went to prestigious schools. They traveled the world, visited the best restaurants, and lived a life few could even imagine. Their wealth was reflected in the grand house they called home, a sprawling Beverly Hills mansion that seemed to stand as a monument to their success. But beneath the polished exterior, things were not as perfect as they seemed. For all the glitz and glamour, there were cracks in the Menendez family's foundation. The pressure on Lyle to live up to his father's expectations was immense. And for Erik, the unspoken weight of living in his older brother's shadow left him isolated, often struggling to find his own identity. But it was not just the weight of expectations that would lead to tragedy. There were darker forces at play, forces within the family that no one could see, but that were felt in the way Jose and Kitty controlled their sons, and in the private moments of the Menendez home. Jose, despite his public image as a successful businessman, had a darker side. He was a controlling and domineering father, often using harsh discipline to enforce his will. Lyle, though outwardly confident, bore the brunt of his father's high expectations, while Erik, more withdrawn, suffered quietly under the same oppressive control. Jose's temper could flare unexpectedly, and when it did, it left emotional scars that would not easily heal. And though the family seemed to be a perfect unit to the outside world, those closest to the Menendez brothers knew there was more to the story, much more. Whispers of abuse, both emotional and physical, began to surface. Yet, despite the growing concern, no one truly knew the extent of the harm being done behind closed doors. The Menendez family maintained its outward image of wealth and success, hiding the dysfunction and the trauma that lurked beneath the surface. But for Lyle and Erik, the pressure continued to build. And when the family's secrets could no longer stay buried, the consequences would be nothing short of catastrophic. This is the story of a family that, on the outside, appeared to have everything. But behind the walls of their mansion, there was something much darker at play, a darkness that, in the end, would lead to unspeakable violence. The night of August 20th, 1989, began like any other evening in Beverly Hills. The warm California air drifted gently through the streets. In the Menendez mansion, the family had just returned from a quiet night out. Jose and Kitty Menendez had gone to see a film, leaving their two sons, Lyle and Erik, at home. It was late, just after 10 p.m., and the house was quiet, almost serene. But this tranquility would soon be shattered in a violent and brutal act that would change everything. Jose and Kitty, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold, entered their home that evening. Inside, the house seemed calm. Kitty, as always, was the picture of composure, warm, graceful, a devoted wife and mother. Jose, the successful businessman, walked in with his usual air of confidence. But for Lyle and Erik, everything had been building up to this moment. The brothers had been living with a pressure that no one could see. Their resentment had been simmering for years. Lyle, the older of the two, had always been driven by his father's demanding expectations. The image of perfection that Jose had created for his family was an impossible weight to bear. And Erik, quieter, more introspective, had been the subject of neglect, emotionally crushed by his father's harshness. In their minds, they had been living under the control of their parents for far too long, feeling trapped, abused, and manipulated. They had decided that it would end that night. The plan was chilling in its simplicity: kill their parents. The decision had been made over the course of several months, but on that night, it was about to become a horrifying reality. Armed with shotguns, the brothers moved toward the living room. The sound of their footsteps was the only noise breaking the silence. They were calm, but there was no turning back. The murder was brutal, shocking in its violence. Lyle, who had been the first to approach his father, fired the first shot. Jose, sitting in his favorite chair, was struck in the back. Kitty screamed in terror, but it was too late. In a matter of seconds, both parents had been gunned down. The shock and violence were overwhelming. The brothers, their hands now stained with blood, did not stop there. They turned the shotguns on their already lifeless parents and fired again, ensuring that the job was done. It was an execution, cold and calculated. But even after the initial wave of violence, the brothers didn't flee the house immediately. Instead, they took a moment. A strange quiet followed, as if the brothers were processing the horrific act they had just committed. They didn't panic, not in the way most would expect. The reality of the situation hadn't fully set in, or perhaps they were simply numb to the enormity of what they had just done. But one thing was certain, this was not a crime of passion. This was something far more deliberate and chilling. In the hours that followed, Lyle and Erik would tell a story to the police that would be riddled with inconsistencies. At first, their reaction seemed typical for two young men who had just found their parents murdered. They claimed to have been out at the movies, and when they returned home, they found their parents lying dead in a pool of blood. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the brothers' story wasn't adding up. Something didn't feel right. Lyle's alibi was shaky at best. His reaction to the deaths, far from grief-stricken, was strangely detached. Erik, though visibly upset, wasn't acting like a person who had just lost their parents. In fact, his behavior seemed almost rehearsed. The more investigators looked into the details, the more they began to question the brothers' story. Their initial shock seemed less like a natural response and more like a performance, a carefully constructed act to cover up the truth. As the police combed through the house, they were struck by the nature of the crime. The scene was grisly. Blood spattered on the walls, on the floor. The violence was not just shocking, it was personal. The brothers had not simply shot their parents in a fit of rage. This had been a deliberate, cold execution. The brutality of the murders suggested something far darker than just a random act of violence. The brothers' own story was starting to unravel, and the more they told, the less believable it became. What the investigators didn't know at that moment was that the truth was far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The Menendez brothers weren't the innocent victims they claimed to be. They were the killers. And soon, the world would come to understand just how deep the family's dysfunction went, and how far the brothers were willing to go to break free from the chains of their parents' control. The hours after the murders were a blur of police activity, shock, and disbelief. The Menendez family had been well known in Beverly Hills, a tight-knit, seemingly perfect family with a reputation for success. But the sight of the blood-streaked mansion and the cold, emotionless behavior of the surviving sons was starting to raise red flags for the investigators. What seemed like a simple case of a family tragedy quickly began to reveal a darker truth. Detective John Jackson was one of the first on the scene. As he walked through the sprawling house, taking in the gruesome details of the crime, something didn't sit right with him. The violence was off the charts. It wasn't just that the parents had been killed, it was the brutality. The excessive nature of the gunfire, the repeated shots to ensure death, this was not a random act of violence. The more he looked around, the more it seemed personal. Whoever did this had a reason, a motive that went beyond what was initially apparent. The first task for the detectives was to interview the surviving sons, Lyle and Erik. At first, their story seemed plausible. They had gone out that night, and when they returned home, they found their parents dead. But something was wrong with the way they told it. Lyle's alibi was shaky. When the police asked him about his whereabouts, he fumbled through the details. His story seemed rehearsed. Then there was Erik, whose emotional response seemed strangely muted for someone who had just lost both parents in such a violent way. At first, Lyle had told police he was in shock, yet his behavior seemed unnervingly calm. He had been seen laughing and joking with others, even hours after the bodies were discovered. Erik, too, appeared more controlled than anyone would expect in such a situation. His emotional state was erratic, at times, distraught, but at others, composed. As detectives began to piece together the brothers' whereabouts, their stories started to crumble. There was another disturbing clue: the brothers had waited almost an hour to contact the police. When Lyle finally called 911, his voice was eerily steady, almost casual. He reported that he and Erik had returned from the movies to find their parents dead in the living room. But there was no sign of forced entry. The family's valuables were untouched. No one had attempted to rob them. This was not a typical home invasion gone wrong. The detectives dug deeper. They spoke to friends, neighbors, and family members. Everyone described a picture-perfect family. But beneath the surface, there were whispers of tension, of conflict, manipulation, and control. Jose Menendez had been a strict father, demanding nothing less than perfection from his sons. Kitty, though more sympathetic, was not immune to his influence. Both Lyle and Erik had been the subjects of intense pressure throughout their lives, pressure to succeed, to conform, and to adhere to a carefully crafted image of success. As detectives learned more about the family dynamic, it became clear that the brothers were not as innocent as they seemed. Interviews with close friends of the Menendez family revealed disturbing details. Lyle and Erik had been spoiled, yes, but they had also been the targets of their father's harsh demands. Both sons had suffered at the hands of Jose's cruelty for years: psychological, verbal, and even physical abuse, as well as the fear of rejection if they did not meet his lofty expectations. But the story wasn't just about a family tragedy, it was about manipulation and deceit. The brothers had already started to paint a picture of themselves as victims, even though they were the ones responsible for the deaths of their parents. Lyle's statements to the police were filled with inconsistencies. He spoke in calm, measured tones, as if he were recounting an event from someone else's life. He appeared more concerned with the material losses from the killings, such as his parents' assets, than with the emotional toll of losing both parents. And then there was Erik, whose story continued to evolve as the investigation went on. First, he claimed to have had no idea that Lyle was going to kill their parents. Then, he admitted he had been in on the plan, but only because he had been emotionally manipulated by Lyle. But as detectives dug deeper, Erik's version of events continued to shift, each new statement adding more questions than answers. With each passing day, the brothers' conflicting stories only raised more suspicion. Detective Jackson knew there was something they weren't saying, something they were hiding. And the more he dug, the clearer it became: the brothers weren't just grieving sons. They were the killers. But the investigation was about to take a darker turn. A breakthrough came when detectives learned that Lyle and Erik had been spending lavishly in the months leading up to the murders. They had been buying expensive cars, going on shopping sprees, and living a life of luxury. It seemed that the brothers had been living in a world where everything was for sale, everything except their souls. The motive, as it would later be revealed, wasn't just about escaping their parents' control, it was about money. It turned out that both brothers had been anticipating the inheritance from their parents' estate. With their deaths, they would inherit millions. But even with this new information, the detectives needed more. They needed to know how deep the manipulation went. And the answer, as it would soon emerge, would shock the nation. The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn when the police discovered something startling. A set of audio tapes, recordings that had been made by the brothers, secretly documenting the abuse and manipulation they had endured at the hands of their father. These tapes would become crucial evidence in the case, and they would provide a window into the true nature of the Menendez family dynamic. To understand the Menendez brothers and the brutal murder of their parents, we must step into a dark, complex world, one filled with childhood trauma, psychological distress, and manipulation. Was this a crime of passion, or was it premeditated cold-blooded murder? Was there a point when the brothers crossed the line from victim to perpetrator, or were they always on the path to this violent end? And most chilling of all, were Lyle and Erik truly victims of their circumstances, or were they the masterminds of their own dark legacy? Psychologists and experts in the field of trauma and abuse often debate the true nature of this case. Some suggest that the brothers' actions were the result of years of severe emotional and physical abuse at the hands of their father, Jose. Others argue that Lyle and Erik's behavior was a result of their own psychological disturbances, manifesting in the form of deep resentment and entitlement. To understand the Menendez brothers, we must explore both possibilities, and perhaps a much darker truth lies somewhere in between. Could this crime have been a spur-of-the-moment decision, a crime of passion, fueled by years of pent-up frustration, anger, and fear? Or was it an act that had been planned for months, even years? After all, the brothers had been living under intense pressure for much of their lives. Jose Menendez was known for his unrelenting drive to push his sons to succeed, demanding perfection, expecting greatness, and leaving no room for failure. The brothers had been conditioned to see failure not just as a disappointment, but as a betrayal. Dr. Thomas Harris, a forensic psychologist, has studied cases of extreme family dysfunction, and in his view, the Menendez brothers fit a disturbing pattern. What we see with the Menendez brothers is the perfect storm of abuse, he says. Jose Menendez was a manipulative, controlling father. He used emotional and physical abuse as a way to maintain dominance over his sons. He expected them to live up to impossible standards, and when they didn't, he would punish them. For Lyle and Erik, this created a dangerous cycle of fear and resentment. And when their father's abuse reached a boiling point, their only way out seemed to be through violence. But could the murders really be an act of self-defense, as the brothers would later claim in their defense during the trial? Could the years of abuse they described justify their actions? Many experts say no. Some argue that while the brothers may have been victims of their father's cruelty, the way they chose to handle their trauma, through murder, was not a symptom of self-defense, but a tragic decision to take control over their lives in the most destructive way possible. As Dr. Harris puts it, this was not an act of defense. It was an act of aggression. A premeditated crime, coldly executed by two young men who had learned to hate their parents. This brings us to a darker possibility, that Lyle and Erik's actions were not just about ending the abuse, but about something far more selfish. The brothers had a lot to gain from their parents' deaths. They would inherit millions, money that could buy them the freedom they so desperately craved. The inheritance, the luxury lifestyle, the sense of entitlement, it all played a significant role in the motivation behind the murders. But could these material motivations exist alongside the emotional trauma they had experienced? Could their sense of entitlement have been so warped by years of psychological manipulation that they saw murder as the only path forward? Dr. Carolyn Delaney, a child psychologist, believes that the emotional abuse in the Menendez home was more complex than physical violence. Emotional abuse is often harder to identify, but it's just as devastating, she explains. Jose Menendez didn't just punish his sons physically, he punished them emotionally, manipulating them into thinking they were never good enough, that they were always failing him. That kind of abuse can twist a child's sense of self-worth and create deep feelings of inadequacy and resentment. For the brothers, this constant emotional manipulation may have made them feel trapped in a life where they were doomed to fail no matter what they did. But while the abuse was real, it's crucial to understand that abuse does not always result in murder. Many children who suffer at the hands of cruel parents don't grow up to become killers. So what is it about the Menendez brothers that pushed them over the edge? Was it simply the years of torment? Or was it something deeper, something more psychological? Psychological theories about the Menendez brothers often focus on the concept of narcissism, a trait that may have been exacerbated by their upbringing. Some experts believe that the brothers, particularly Lyle, were raised to view the world through a lens of entitlement and control. They were taught to believe that they were special, that the rules didn't apply to them. For Lyle, who was groomed to be the next heir to his father's legacy, the idea of failure was not just an embarrassment, it was a threat to his very identity. He was the one who had to succeed, no matter the cost. When that identity was challenged by his father's abuse, it seems that Lyle believed murder was the only way to regain control. Erik, on the other hand, seemed to have suffered from a deep sense of emotional neglect. As the younger brother, he may have been more easily manipulated by Lyle, who acted as both the protector and the instigator. Erik's psychological state was fragile, his emotional health had been devastated by his father's cruelty. In the aftermath of the murders, Erik appeared lost, conflicted, even apologetic, as if he was struggling to reconcile his role in the deaths with his inherent need for approval and love. The brothers, in many ways, were two sides of the same coin. One driven by a need for control, the other desperate for affection and acceptance. But this emotional chaos didn't just play out in their home. It was clear that the brothers had created a warped sense of family in their minds, a family where loyalty and love were conditional, based on meeting their father's impossible standards. Murder, to them, may have been the only way to break free from a world where they felt like prisoners in their own home. They believed that with their parents gone, they could start fresh, without the chains of emotional abuse, and with a fortune to carry them forward. Dr. Sarah Jennings, a clinical psychologist, believes that Lyle and Erik's actions reflect a tragic pattern of behavior that can be seen in many cases of extreme familial abuse. These kinds of murders, while shocking, are not as rare as we might think, she says. They often occur when children are taught that they are worthless, that they are incapable of ever living up to expectations, and that violence is the only way to gain control. These children often grow up with a distorted sense of morality, and in the case of the Menendez brothers, that sense of morality was completely broken. But could the Menendez brothers truly have been innocent victims of their father's cruelty? Or were they calculating, manipulative young men who saw murder as a way out of the oppressive world they had been raised in? Could it be that the violence was both a consequence of their trauma and a reflection of their own moral decay? This case remains a tragedy not just for the victims, but for the brothers themselves. In the end, the Menendez brothers are not easily understood. Were they monstrous killers, driven by greed and hatred? Or were they simply two young men, tragically warped by years of abuse and manipulation? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere between these extremes, a haunting reminder of how far the human mind can be pushed before it breaks. The trial of Lyle and Erik Menendez was one of the most sensational legal battles in American history. The case was not just about two sons who had murdered their parents. It became a national spectacle, an emotional, psychological, and legal drama that captivated millions. The media frenzy surrounding the trial was overwhelming, with every twist and turn dissected by reporters, while the brothers' lives were exposed to the world. But beneath the headlines, the Menendez brothers faced a far more personal, and far more terrifying, battle, the battle for their freedom. The courtroom quickly became a stage for competing narratives. On one side, a defense arguing that the brothers had been victims of long-term abuse so severe it had driven them to murder in a desperate attempt to escape. On the other side, a prosecution bent on portraying Lyle and Erik as cold-blooded killers, motivated by greed and a sense of entitlement, who had murdered their parents for their fortune. From the start, the trial was filled with shocking revelations, claims of a dark family secret, psychological turmoil, and hidden abuse. As the brothers took the stand, they would tell their stories, and the world would listen. But would the court believe them? And would the brothers' emotional pleas for mercy be enough to save them from life in prison? The high-profile nature of the Menendez trial made it a media circus. Every aspect of the case was picked apart by the press, from the brothers' upbringing to the gory details of the murders. Cameras in the courtroom captured everything, and the brothers' every movement, every word, became part of a national narrative. But it wasn't just the shocking nature of the crime that drew attention. It was the trial's most dramatic moments, the emotional breakdowns, the raw testimony, the long-hidden secrets. It was clear this was not just another criminal case. This was a battle for the truth, and for the future of two young men who had once been innocent children. The defense's argument was simple yet deeply compelling. Lyle and Erik Menendez were victims of severe emotional and physical abuse at the hands of their father. Their father, Jose, had been a controlling, violent man, using both physical punishment and psychological manipulation to maintain power over his sons. The defense argued that the brothers had suffered a lifetime of torment, and on the night of the murders, they acted out of fear and desperation. Their claim was that they had been so broken by the abuse they endured that they couldn't see any other way to escape. In their defense, the brothers' attorneys presented testimony from psychologists and experts, who painted a harrowing picture of their upbringing. This was not a normal family, one expert testified. This was a family defined by violence, manipulation, and a total lack of emotional support. The Menendez brothers didn't just murder their parents, they murdered the very concept of family that they had been taught to believe in. But as the defense tried to humanize the brothers, to present them as damaged victims of a monstrous father, the prosecution painted a different story. The prosecution argued that Lyle and Erik were not innocent victims, but rather two young men who had decided to kill their parents in cold blood for financial gain. They were the sons of a wealthy, successful man who had everything they could possibly want, except control. And that, the prosecution argued, was the true motive for murder. The brothers, in their quest for freedom and wealth, had meticulously planned the killings, making sure to set up a convincing alibi. It wasn't about self-defense, the prosecution claimed. It was about getting rid of the people who stood between them and their inheritance. The trial was a study in contrasts. On one side, the defense worked hard to paint the brothers as emotionally fragile, traumatized victims. On the other, the prosecution sought to depict them as manipulative, calculating individuals who had murdered without remorse. The brothers were caught in the middle, their fates hanging on the emotional intensity of the courtroom drama. Then came the moment that would forever change the course of the trial, the moment when Erik Menendez took the stand. He was calm at first, but then something inside him seemed to break. As the defense attorney began to ask about his childhood, Erik's composure shattered. His voice trembled as he recalled the abuse he had suffered, and tears streamed down his face. "I was scared," he sobbed, "I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I didn't do something, it was going to be worse. I didn't want to die." The scene was heartbreaking. Erik, the younger brother, had always been more emotionally fragile, and in that moment, his breakdown seemed to confirm everything the defense had argued, that he had been a broken, vulnerable child who had been pushed to the edge by years of emotional torment. But was this breakdown an act of genuine remorse, or was it part of a strategy to evoke sympathy from the jury? The jury, of course, had to decide. And as Erik's breakdown reverberated throughout the courtroom, it seemed to shift the tone of the trial. The defense had made their case, had the jury bought it? Or was it all just another tactic, a ploy to avoid the harsh realities of their actions? But the most explosive moment of the trial was still to come. During one of the most dramatic points in the proceedings, Lyle Menendez, the older brother, would take the stand. With his sharply pressed suit and carefully chosen words, Lyle's demeanor seemed calm, almost too calm. The defense had already established that the brothers' actions had been influenced by their father's abuse, but when the prosecution began to cross-examine Lyle, the cracks began to show. In a chilling exchange, the prosecution confronted Lyle with his extravagant lifestyle, the lavish cars, the expensive watches, the lifestyle he had inherited after his parents' deaths. Lyle, in his own defense, claimed that he had been entitled to all of it, that he had earned it through years of hard work and perseverance. But the prosecution didn't let him off the hook. They pressed him on his true motives. Was it really about escaping abuse, or was it about money, power, and control? As the trial continued, the media frenzy only escalated. Television stations broadcast every moment live, and the brothers became household names, symbols of a deeply fractured family, of a dysfunctional home turned deadly. But for Lyle and Erik, the public scrutiny was just the beginning. The jury would eventually decide their fates, but not before the most shocking part of all. In a twist that no one saw coming, just as the defense was making their closing arguments, the world learned of a detail that had remained hidden for years. Something so disturbing, so dark, that it would forever alter the public's perception of the Menendez brothers. But that story, that final revelation, would have to wait for the verdict. As the trial of Lyle and Erik Menendez unfolded, the nation watched with bated breath. But beyond the courtroom drama, a more troubling question lingered: what was the truth behind the Menendez brothers' actions? Was it truly a crime born out of desperation and fear, a defense of survival against the years of abuse they claimed to have suffered? Or was it something darker, a cold, calculated act of murder driven by greed and entitlement? And how did the media, in all its sensationalized frenzy, shape the way we understand the case? The brothers' defense team was adamant: their clients had been victims of years of psychological and physical abuse at the hands of their father. The defense painted a picture of two young men driven to kill not out of malice, but out of fear, panic, and a desperate desire to escape. Lyle and Erik's emotional testimony seemed to support this. Erik's breakdown on the stand, his tearful recounting of the abuse, struck a chord with many who saw them as tragic victims. For them, the murder was not premeditated. It was an act of survival. But then there was the prosecution's version of events, one that painted a very different picture. According to the prosecution, the brothers had killed not in self-defense, but in cold blood. They had plotted and planned the murders to secure their inheritance, and once their parents were dead, they would be free to indulge in a life of luxury. The prosecution emphasized the brothers' post-murder behavior, their calm, even nonchalant actions in the aftermath of the killings. Lyle's lavish lifestyle, the expensive cars, and the ostentatious displays of wealth in the months following the murder, painted a picture of two young men who had no remorse, only an insatiable desire for money and power. But in the court of public opinion, the debate raged on. The media coverage, with its constant speculation and sensational headlines, only deepened the divide. On one side, there were those who saw the brothers as victims of a broken, abusive home, two young men whose actions had been driven by a lifetime of trauma. On the other side, there were those who believed the Menendez brothers had taken advantage of their parents' wealth and security, murdering them in cold blood for the money they so desperately wanted. The truth, however, is far more complicated. When we separate fact from fiction, what we find is a story of a family in crisis, one marked by years of dysfunction, emotional neglect, and control. There were, undeniably, elements of abuse in the Menendez household. Jose Menendez's behavior, as reported by the brothers, was cruel and controlling. The psychological impact of living under that constant pressure cannot be underestimated. And the defense's argument that the brothers were driven to kill as a result of their trauma does hold some merit. The emotional distress they suffered was real. But does that justify their actions? And was their claim of self-defense truly believable? What we also know is that the murders were brutal, cold, and methodical. Despite their emotional testimonies, the way the brothers carried out the killings, a double execution-style shooting, raises questions about their true motives. Was this truly a crime of desperation, or was it a carefully orchestrated act to get rid of their parents and claim the inheritance they believed was rightfully theirs? As the trial progressed, the lines between fact and fiction became increasingly blurred. The media played a key role in shaping public opinion, sensationalizing the brothers' emotional breakdowns and their claims of abuse, while simultaneously focusing on the more salacious aspects of the case: Lyle's expensive tastes, Erik's calm demeanor in the aftermath of the killings. These elements fed into a narrative of moral ambiguity. The brothers were either tragic victims of abuse, or greedy murderers who saw their parents as obstacles in their pursuit of wealth. In a sense, the case was a mirror for society's own struggles with justice and empathy. How do we reconcile the humanity of a perpetrator with the horror of their crime? How do we balance the truth of their suffering with the severity of their actions? The Menendez brothers' case forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions about family, power, and accountability. In the end, the truth may never be fully understood. The brothers were convicted of first-degree murder, but the questions about their true motives, the blend of abuse, entitlement, and desperation, will never truly go away. Was it self-defense, or was it murder for money? Was their emotional distress enough to justify the killings? The line between victim and perpetrator, hero and villain, is not always clear. And in this case, it never will be. The trial of Lyle and Erik Menendez ended as many had predicted. Both brothers were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A case that had gripped the nation with its emotional drama, shocking revelations, and media frenzy, now came to a close. But for the Menendez brothers, the end of the trial marked just the beginning of a new, uncertain reality. For Lyle and Erik, the life they once knew, the life of privilege and luxury, was gone. The mansion in Beverly Hills, once a symbol of their family's success, was now an empty shell. No longer could the brothers live the life of indulgence that they had so desperately fought for. The money, the fame, the wealth, they were all gone. All that remained was a prison cell, a stark reminder of the choices they had made, and the lives they had taken. Behind bars, the Menendez brothers would spend their lives in isolation, each locked in their own prison of guilt, regret, and the haunting memories of their parents. Erik, the quieter of the two, would later go on to express feelings of remorse, even claiming that he never truly wanted to kill his parents. Lyle, the more outspoken of the two, would remain adamant that the abuse they had suffered was the driving force behind the murders. But despite their differing attitudes, both would spend every day of their lives wondering whether the world would ever fully understand the reasons for their actions. The public's fascination with the Menendez case would not fade with the brothers' convictions. In fact, it would continue to haunt the American imagination for years to come. Was it truly a crime of survival, or was it the result of a darker, more disturbing desire for wealth? Could the brothers have been so emotionally broken by years of abuse that they genuinely saw no other option but to murder their parents? Or was there something more sinister, something more calculated, behind their actions? The Menendez family legacy was forever altered. The once respected name of Jose Menendez, the successful businessman and father, would now be forever associated with tragedy and violence. The Menendez estate, once filled with wealth and grandeur, would become a symbol of loss and destruction. And though the family's wealth was eventually divided up, with much of it going to the brothers' defense attorneys and legal fees, the real cost was far more personal and far-reaching. For the public, the case became one of the most debated and discussed true crime stories of the 20th century. The emotional and psychological complexities of the Menendez brothers' motives, coupled with the horror of the murders themselves, would continue to fuel discussions about the nature of abuse, family dynamics, and justice for years to come. And for the Menendez brothers themselves, life behind bars would not provide the answers they were seeking. In fact, it might never offer them the peace they so desperately wanted. The tragic loss of their parents, coupled with the brutal nature of their crime, left them with no easy path forward. Would they ever find redemption, or was their past too dark to ever escape? The story of Lyle and Erik Menendez is not just a tale of crime, it is a reflection of the complexities of human nature, of the powerful forces that shape us, and of the consequences that follow when those forces go unchecked. It is a story that challenges our understanding of justice, of family, and of the fine line between victim and perpetrator. And as for the Menendez brothers, two young men who once had everything, what remains now is a legacy forever tied to the lives they took, and the broken family they left behind. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about the Menendez brothers' case? Were they truly victims of abuse, manipulated by their parents into a cycle of fear and despair? Or did they commit cold-blooded murder, driven by greed and a desire for wealth? The question remains, can we ever truly understand the depth of their trauma? Or was this just a carefully orchestrated crime for money, with no regard for the lives they took? We know this case has sparked intense debate and strong emotions, and we want you to share your thoughts. What do you think happened that night in the Menendez home? Were the brothers' actions justified, or did they cross a line that can never be excused? Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Do you think the justice system got it right, or are there still unanswered questions about the brothers' true motives? As always, we love hearing your perspectives. Your theories, your insights. This case is far from over in the minds of many, and we want to keep the conversation going. So, what's your take on the Menendez brothers? Was it murder for money, or a crime driven by years of suffering and trauma? As we reach the end of this dark journey, we must ask, did we truly uncover the full story of the Menendez brothers? Was justice served, or did the trial merely scratch the surface of a much deeper, more complex tale? The twists in this case were as shocking as they were tragic. The brothers' claims of abuse, once dismissed as a desperate defense, were met with skepticism, yet some believe they were not lies, but the painful echoes of a tormented childhood. The murder itself was brutal, but was it truly the result of years of fear and manipulation? Or did the brothers commit cold-blooded murder for the riches and power they so desperately sought? Lyle and Erik Menendez, once two young men living in the lap of luxury, are now forever known for the brutal deaths of their parents. But despite the verdict, the story does not end there. The questions linger. What really happened that night? What role did their upbringing play in their actions? Was the truth about their past ever fully revealed, or was it lost in the noise of a sensational trial? The truth may never be fully known. Was the Menendez family really as perfect as it appeared on the outside? Or were their secrets so dark, so twisted, that even the brothers themselves could not fully comprehend them? The Menendez brothers' legacy remains a dark, lingering question in the annals of true crime. A tragedy that forced us to question the nature of family, justice, and the things we are willing to do for survival. In the end, the true story of the Menendez brothers may never be fully told. What we do know is that their actions have left a permanent mark on the world, a case that continues to divide and haunt us. The shadows of their past will follow them forever, and the legacy of their crime will never be forgotten. Was this murder the result of years of suffering, or the actions of two men who sought to escape their past by taking the lives of those who had given them life? The truth remains just out of reach. And that uncertainty will forever cloud the story of the Menendez brothers. If you found this case as gripping and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into chilling true crime stories, and share your thoughts with us in the comments below. What do you think? Do you believe the Menendez brothers were truly victims of their circumstances, or did they deserve their fate? We'd love to hear your theories, opinions, and any cases you think we should dive into next. Your feedback keeps this channel going. So, make sure to subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and let's keep the conversation going.